Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Doug Duncan.
It's great to be here. Thanks.
Well, we're so happy to have you here at News You Can Use, here in Alpharetta, Georgia, Supreme Lending. So in your career as an economist, and I've been following you forever and been friends with you for a long time, you've made thousands of forecasts. I mean, thousands. And not all of them were accurate, right? It's great business to be in because you don't always have to be right. But by the way, I've done a lot of that myself, leading every day. The list of awards, though, that you've won arguably suggests that you've been the best in your field for quite some time. Recently, you made a forecast that made the news. That's not really unusual. A lot of your forecasts do make the news, but this one was fascinating. Your forecast was just a bit unusual. And I wanted to share this with the audience, which is you forecasted your own retirement and it got carried by the news. Tell me about that.
Yeah, there was a little industry newsletter that caught a whiff that I might be retiring, and they called and said, "Is that true?" I said, "Yeah." They said, "Do people know?" I said, "I don't know." And so he printed a little thing, and then National Mortgage News, a reporter, Brad Finkelstein, who's known me for a long time, read that blurb from that newsletter, and he called and said, "Is that true?" And I said, "Yes." And so he printed an article, and then Yahoo picked it up, and that was their headline, which I love that headline. Hopefully I get that right.
I asked you last night, right?
Right.
We did have a couple glasses of red wine, but I asked you, is this still accurate? Yeah. Can we still count on your forecast?
December 27th. I'm actually no longer the chief economist. I stepped down from that role 2 weeks ago, and Mark Palin, who has been with me for 15 years, is now the chief economist at Fannie Mae. I was just reading the press release on the single-family housing starts this morning, and it was Mark that was the first release that's gone out without my name on it. I was like, oh, that felt different. So December 27th to be my last day at Fannie Mae.
Well, there's another noteworthy voice in a business that I care greatly about, college football. Anybody else here care about college football? Yeah. You care about a different team than I do, right? But his retirement came with him smiling. I think for most people know him for the first time in like 17 years of watching him and knowing him. His expertise and his competence have gone nowhere. He's got a wry sense of humor as well. We're learning more about that. And I thought a lot about you recently, knowing you were coming into Atlanta because you're retiring. You've been kind of a GOAT, greatest of all time in your business and your competence, and it won't end. People still want to hear from you. So thank you for being here today. Service professionals, all of us, right? We actually get paid based on what we know. It's of course, about serving other people, but what we know, what we own in terms of competence helps people in the single biggest investment they ever make in their entire life. And so today, I'm going to make a forecast. And that is that all of us are going to know more when we leave. All right. So you ready to get to work?
Hopefully too, sure.
All right. So, the Federal Reserve, it's arguably the most powerful financial force on the planet. It's arguable, but it could be the most influential force financially on the planet. And you and I have talked about this in the past. They're always in the news, but sometimes more. And when more is taking place, it's usually not as good for the reasons that it is. And since May of 2000, they've been a headliner in the news, and they're back again right now. I thought for our audience, we want to teach them more. You hear about the Fed. Let's learn a little bit about the Fed. So first, describe the structure. Like there's 12 banks around the country. By the way, there's a map here that shows you where they're at. But tell us what the Fed banks do, what the Federal Reserve and what the Fed banks do.
Yeah, so it's a system. The fact that it's a system is important. They're not just independent entities, though they do have spheres of responsibility that are tied to their geography. So they manage currency in the system. They have a regulatory responsibility of oversight over the financial institutions that are chartered in their district. So they have a regulatory role on compliance. The presidents of each of the regional banks are all members of the Federal Open Market Committee, which is the 7 presidential appointees plus the 12 bank presidents. The system was founded in 1913, and you can see a little bit of the age of it by the location of each of those district banks was a function of the economic geography of the United States at that time. It might be different if you redid it today. It might look somewhat different. And some people have raised a question about that. So there's a couple of other important things to note. The positions of being a presidential appointee are 14-year terms. So if you were appointed a governor in year 1 of that term and resigned in year 6, the person who is appointed to replace you enters in year 7. The initial intention was if someone was in office for 14 years, it would isolate the organization from presidential politics, because that would run over like more than 3 presidential terms. But the fact that people don't stay for 14 years, the last person that served the 14-year term was a man named Ned Gramlich, which I think in the early 90s, he finished his 14th year. And since then, no one has served a 14-year term. So it's been in the political news and will be in the political news, in part because of what you've said about the recent conditions, particularly since 2000. I would expect there'll be more discussion of the Fed.
So they have we break it down just like all the folks in the audience have jobs. And how do you measure the success of the work that we do, that I do, or that they do every day? There's a dual mandate that we understand exists with the Fed. So these are the things that they are specifically responsible for managing. Tell us about the dual mandate.
Yeah, until 1978, their sole mandate was price level stability. The implication being no inflation, but also no deflation. Simply $1 today is worth $1 1 year from now in purchasing power. That has changed in a couple of important ways. In 1978, a bill called Humphrey-Hawkins was passed, which gave them a labor mandate. That is maximizing employment while maintaining price stability. Then this will be the homework section. The minutes of each Federal Reserve Board meeting are released 3 weeks after that meeting takes place. But a lot of people don't know transcripts, in other words, who said what to who, are released 5 years later.
Wow.
So you can actually go back and take a look at who talked about things. So your assignment is to read the July 1996 minutes in which Alan Greenspan and Janet Yellen had a discussion, should we set a target for inflation as opposed to no inflation? In the course of that, Janet Yellen asked Greenspan, what's the appropriate level of inflation? And he said, it's the level of inflation that does not impact either business or household decision-making. And then she said, well, could you give us a number? And in parentheses, it says laughter. And so he said, the proper rate is 0 if properly measured. So today, you can fast forward to Ben Bernanke's institution of a 2% target. So there's not a number related to employment. It is just maximizing employment in an area of price level stability, which they have chosen to define as 2%.
So we have dual mandate. We have full employment, like people who want to work, they're willing and capable of working, making sure that they can get jobs, and at the same time keeping inflation at a nominal rate, at a minimal rate. And 2% is kind of the number that seems to be traveling these days, right? So, and it's a little bit akin to housing, right? You don't want the house value to be deflating. Nobody does. It'd be hard to sell houses if that was the case. We also don't want it to be at 20% a year or 1.5% a month, because we're all living through that era now and the consequences of it. Hey, so there's a lot of conspiracy theories in the world. One of the questions I have to ask you now, it wasn't on my schedule to ask, but we talked about it a bit last night. So there was a payroll report that came out. It comes out the first Friday of every month, by the way. And that's the dual mandate. There's employment. What's the strength of employment, which feeds into the strength of the economy. And the forecast by all of these very bright forecasters, really bright forecasters, like guys I know, was 150,000 jobs that was going to be created. So if you go back a couple of weeks, rates had gotten down where they wanted to go below 6. They were pushing to get there. And then the non-farm payroll came out at 254,000 jobs versus 150, which is a lot stronger. And I had at least 5 texts saying that I'm sure the government is fixing this. So how this non-farm payrolls, how do they actually calculate it?
The Labor Department report is based on 2 separate sources of data. So the technical term for one side is called the Establishment Survey. So every company that has 1,000 employees or more has to report. They are required to report. And then for those companies who have less than 1,000, there's a sample that is surveyed about what's happening with the number of people on their payroll and wage rates and those kinds of things. There's a second side called the household, and that is a survey of 60,000 households asking them, are you working? Are you more than one job? Is it full-time, part-time? That's the side that the unemployment rate comes from. So it's actually 2 different surveys, which results in a whole bunch of different pieces of information, most of which are not publicized, but which economists spend a lot of time digging around in. So one of the things that has happened broadly to statistics at the federal level is a reduction in survey response rates. That's been falling for some time. So if the response rates falls, the chances are pretty good that the error rate will start to increase. So there was a view, and I got some of the same calls that you did, is this being rigged because of the election? My answer to that is no. The people who are in our statistical agencies are professionals. They're trained in statistical survey work, those kinds of things. I'm highly doubtful that there's a political influence in that. But there is measurement error. That we're certain of. The second point that raised that same question was there is a time over which employment data are re-benchmarked because additional information comes in over time. So there is this major re-benchmarking that takes place annually. And in this instance, the number of jobs had been overstated by 818,000 jobs. And so that raised the question.
The conspiracy.
Conspiracy thing. I don't believe that was true because if you go back and look at the history of those benchmarks, there are about 7 more that are roughly equal in size, equally distributed of overestimates and underestimates. So I just don't believe that there is some conspiracy.
So on Saturday while I'm watching college football, this is the kind of stuff that you're digging into.
Absolutely, and it's getting ready for our cocktail parties, which you might not want to attend.
Some of the funnier stories that Doug could tell you, you get a chance maybe to talk to him today, is going to an Economist cocktail party. And what they ask, because I've asked them, what do you guys talk about?
Well, you're not serious when the elbow patches start coming off.
All right, so the Fed has a tool in their toolbox, a number of them. Some of them they've made up. But the tool that they have is the cost of money in a short-term base. I'd like you to explain that. And then also, does their dropping rates, does that affect the entire yield curve, including 30-year fixed-rate mortgages? So a lot of our consumers, when they heard 2 weeks ago that the Fed dropped rates 50 basis points, they just make an assumption. That means that all rates are now 50 basis points lower. So what rate do they control? And then does it directly or is it indirectly in correlation with their management?
Yeah, their primary tool is the Fed funds rate, federal funds rate. The federal funds rate is the rate at which banks lend to each other overnight. So it's a very short-term interest rate. In fact, it's a 24-hour interest rate. That's very different than a 30-year fixed rate mortgage and how that gets priced. So as you saw, when they cut the Fed funds unexpectedly by 50 basis points, when the market was more so expecting 25, the 10-year Treasury actually went up. By about 35 basis points. In fact, that if you look at every time the Fed has started a rate cutting cycle, that happens every time.
Rates go up.
Rates go up initially.
Yeah.
Then eventually, depending on where the economy goes, that those things change. One of the things that Warren Buffett said that was simple but really instructive to me is, in the short run, the market is a voting machine. In the long run, the market is a weighing machine.
Ooh.
So what were the votes that took place that raised that 10-year Treasury? Some people were voting because they said, oh, the Fed has achieved their target on inflation, so rates are clearly going to continue coming down. Some said, oh, we've averted a recession, so growth is going to be stronger, having averted the recession. A third group said, well, it's uncertain in the near term, but the 10-year, over 10 years, we think that the Fed's support will lead to stronger economic growth than we had thought. Which of those was the dominant one? I don't know. But that's the voting machine aspect. And we will know in the future what the weight of that is by what we see in economic activity.
Got it. So we'll just track that along with you. The forecast, best I can tell, you can read a lot of different sources, but is like over the next year to 15 months, there'll be like 150 basis points of additional loosening or reducing of rates by the Fed.
So this will be a test of market actually agreed with me or not, because now he's doing the forecast. So I told him, I said, I'm going to be watching to see where you tell me the truth. We have in the forecast another 25 basis point cut in November and then again in December, and 125 basis point cut each of the 4 quarters of next year. The big debate among economists, and including within the Fed, is what's the longer term interest rate, which is neither stimulative nor depressive for economic activity. They call that the neutral rate.
Mm-hmm.
There's a big debate about exactly what that is. Some think it's as low as 1%. Others think as high as 4%. I'm kind of in the 3 to 3.5% range, which is higher than the average in that. Part of that is conditioned upon the fact that we are running these huge deficits and running up a debt in a time period where there's going to be a lot of pressure geopolitically in the world.
So let's talk about a topic that is, I know, important to our audience and that you've been studying for your entire career, which is housing, right? So we've been through some fascinating last 4 or 5 seasons in housing. First, crazy good, almost too good. And the consequences of that are the next generation market, which is the last couple of years, which is you get the other side of that. Housing, I've always thought, is kind of a mature business. People need it. They need roofs, rent them or own them, but they need roofs. So in the past, you and I have talked about housing, and you told me that demographics, number of people, right, drives demand, employment, other than that one period of time, like in 2004, 5, 6, 7, when you could borrow without employment, you actually need a job to own a home, right? Or
well, we ran the experiment. If you didn't have it
didn't go well. It was called
the
worldwide financial meltdown, right? And then affordability. So if you think about our business, and we're talking to people every day that work in this industry, and they come into the industry, and it could be a bad time today, but what's going to drive it in the long run? Here's good news for all of us. Demographics in the Southeast, the ingress or people coming to the Southeast is substantially better than people leaving and going elsewhere. We've got maps and stuff we can show you about that, but our market is, if you want to check the box on demographics, Georgia and Florida are amazing. Employment in the country, employment rates are 4.3, and yet in Georgia, they're 3.6. And in Florida, 3.3. So the demographics coming here creates an incredibly favorable environment. And then the last is affordability. What a dirty word today.
Yeah, it's not unprecedented, but it's pretty close.
I asked Doug a question one time, like 6-7 years ago, before this whole crazy market started post-COVID. I said, do rates really matter? And he said, no, not unless they go up really fast, in which case incomes don't travel that fast. And that's kind of important for right now. Home prices over the last 25 years up just under 5% on average, except 10% has been the last 4 years, the average. And then interest rates did indeed get in the twos. We've forgotten that now, but they went from 4 to 7.5 in the second half of 22, 2 years ago. And those things in combination have created the weakest affordability that we've seen in a generation. Meaning the cost of getting a home price combined with the cost of money has just been exorbitant, not to mention insurance now, which is added to the list, and taxes. Do we have to have housing prices come down to get a recovery? Or how do you see this playing out in terms of housing moving back to, I won't use the word normal. You told me not to do that anymore because there is no normal anymore, right?
Yeah.
But how do we get back to a demand that's kind of consistent with the demographics and the employment that we have?
Yeah, the variables that you have to address are what you talked about. Income, that's the most important. And there's a path to maximum homeownership rate for any age group that's related to income. And it typically peaks in their mid-50s because that's when earnings lifetime peak, right? So that's the first most important variable. The second one is interest rates. And of course, interest rates go up and down depending on what's happening with economic activity. If you go back to when Humphrey Hawkins was passed, within a 2-year time frame there, interest rates were 18%. There was still housing activity. People still bought and sold homes. They were just, you had to figure out ways to make that work. And then house prices is the other thing. And the house prices is really a function of supply and demand. And we're 2 to 4 million too few units of owned and rented housing from what our demographics would suggest. So there's going to be continued pressure on house price going forward. So if interest rates come down, you may well see an offsetting increase in house price simply because it will spur demand and against a market where the demographics of demand are stronger than the development of supply. I was just looking at this morning, the census report on housing starts and permits came out. Permits, which is what we have tracked more closely because in the single family space, that usually is an indication production will start shortly. We're only up 0.3% from last month to this month. There's a growing inventory of new homes available for sale. That's partly because of the imbalance in the existing and new home supplies, where new homes are a much higher share of first-time homebuyer purchases than is typically the case because there just isn't the existing homes available for sale. That's those 2% mortgages that you were talking about. A lot of people got those, and they're unlikely to give them up. We actually did a survey of the people in our portfolio and asked them, are you staying in your property simply because of the interest rate? About 20% of people said, yeah, we have no intention to move as long as we have this interest rate. More like 30% or more said, well, actually, the interest rate's great to have, but it's also combined with other things that we like about this place that we are at, and we're unlikely to move because of the combination of factors. So over half of people fell in those two categories. By the way, that survey is up on our website. You can go there. There's no paywall or anything like that. So a reason I spoke to the AICPA Bank Accounting Conference, there were 1,500 people in the room and online. So I asked, how many of you have a mortgage of less than 4%? And 3/4 of the hands went up. I said, now, if you are required to move, how many of you have thought, I will keep that house because the difference between that mortgage payment and rents in that market might be $1,000, and I might rent that property use the difference in payments to subsidize the interest rate on the house that I have to buy and make the move. And 3/4 of those hands went up. So the potential is that we've converted a whole bunch of the millennials into investors, right? Because of that 2% mortgage rate.
Wow, that's fascinating. So, one of the things that we talked about yesterday, the storm in Florida. By the way, Doug spends half his time, will be less than half his time in the future in Washington and otherwise, right, out speaking to groups, and then you spend the balance of your time in Cape Coral.
Yeah, dodging hurricanes.
I asked Doug about Cape Coral, and how did your children describe it?
God's waiting room.
I didn't ask it because Doug and I are seasoned at this point. He just offered that. I thought that was fascinating. But anyway, in talking to folks throughout Florida and really in general, good news is if you're a homeowner with a low rate, that your value of your home went up in an extraordinary way in the last 4 years. We've just not seen that in this generation. The other news is now your taxes have gone up and your insurance has gone up. So we have our past customers calling us all the time that, I have a fixed rate. Why did you raise our mortgage payment? And we're like, well, we didn't raise your mortgage payment. Taxes and insurance are not something we establish. We collect for them, of course. Do you think that has a chance? Because folks in the audience here, you might give up on customers that bought in 20 and 21 that they may just not want to ever move. Does that have a chance to affect the rate lock concept, which is that people just can't afford the house any longer because the variable cost of taxes and insurance have increased?
For existing owners who are on fixed incomes, that's the place where that's likely to be more of a challenge. There's a certain lack of understanding of why insurance companies are in business and what your insurance company coverage actually is intended to accomplish. So if your insurance is at replacement cost and the value of the property and cost of its replacement goes up, it would be pretty reasonable to expect that the insurance premium is going to go up. Right.
I think so, yeah.
So, but that's not necessarily what's on the mind of the buyer when they're buying the house. They're thinking about this is a place we're going to locate our family and raise our household. So there is, to some degree, there's an educational issue there, and we've highlighted that in some of the surveys that we've done at Fannie Mae. What do people actually know? For example, my favorite was, do you know your credit score? And something like 80% of people said yes. What is your credit score? Something like 30% of them gave a number that was outside the valid range. So
you think you know your credit score.
Right. So you'd be surprised at the number of basic things that it's not a daily issue for people. So they don't actually spend time that you spend as professionals in this field with familiarity of all the terms and all the things that can change. The property tax issue, it's different in Florida because they don't have a state income tax. So there are some nuances that are different in Florida from other states. But one of the things that people have not considered is that to the extent that there is climate change that's altering the risks related to properties, there will probably be some infrastructure investments that need to be made at the local level that will require property taxes for the funding. Yeah. So there's, I think, also a lack of appreciation that is a rising potential.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of a big deal as we represent buyers going forward, right? That they be fully informed of the cost of homeownership.
You want them to be successful. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, you're in the business of helping them locate their family. You want them to be able to sustain that. And
sometimes defining success is we want them to just close the transaction.
Yeah.
It's not the best of us.
Right.
But no, it is. You brought up the credit scores. Our Supreme Essentials program has not what your credit score is, but why it is what it is, so that people can begin to manage their credit scores so that their cost of credit cards or everything, auto loans, home loans, everything's driven now on credit score in terms of costs, as you're well familiar
Well, on that front, I've had somebody that asked me my opinion on something. I said, well, I told my children, I said, it's great that you have an opinion. It's better if you have an informed opinion.
Always.
So knowing your credit score, there's a difference between a good guesstimate and what it actually is.
So let's talk about the most recent housing forecast, which I've been tracking for 20 some years with Fannie Mae. I mean, they obviously are in the business. They're the largest issuer of debt in the world, other than, the federal government. So to the extent that they spend a bit of time, how many staff members did you have when you were running your forecasting business?
Well, the people that are directly involved in the forecast is only 5 people. But in the entire group, which I've designed as kind of an internal consultancy, we had 38 staff.
Yeah, so these experts are out collecting information, data that helps build these forecasts. And like any forecast, there are things we don't know that are going to happen.
Sure.
Israel, Ukraine, and then you bake those in over time to your forecast. But you went through just recently, and by the way, in the middle of each month, right after the 15th, they update their forecast, so you can track it along with us. And I've been doing this for a long time because for our business, the best information, opinion isn't mine. It's the best informed opinion. So I try to collected as much information possible, so when we make our investment decisions here, that we're doing it with the best information imaginable. The data for 23 in the center of the page is total home sales. When you see that bracketed, it's in millions annualized. So in the first quarter of 23, we were at 4.9 million. According to Fannie, those numbers are now kind of posted, and they're not like the employment numbers. They won't be revised by millions.
Not dramatically.
So that number is substantially below where it was in 22 at the beginning of January. If you go back to 21, we were catching 7 million annualized. So when you think about an industry like ours dropping from 7 million down to below 5 million on an annualized basis, it's breathtaking. You go backwards and look for those types of events in our industry, you're going to be looking for a long time. It's just hard to find them. The good news is we're in the third quarter of 24 now, annualizing at 4.6. So things have continued to get, they've gotten stable. The first 2 quarters of this year were a bit better. This quarter is depressed against the first 2 quarters. We thought when we got into May, like, hey, we're catching some support now. This thing is starting to move. And then we came up with a million different reasons why it wasn't in August. Back to school, NAR, college football. I went through a whole list of them. It has to be all of them together. Something's happening here. It's fascinating. But if we look forward, and I think it's really important, because hope says in the scripture, deferred makes the heart sick. So we all need to be able to present to our own folk some degree of hope, especially when the data tells us that it would be fair to do that. Tell us about housing sales forecast. We're in the third quarter. Walk us through 2025, and tell us how you guys are forecasting the next 15 months.
Yeah, let me start by going back to your statement that we shouldn't use the word normal. So there is a question about whether COVID and the policy responses to COVID changed the structure of the U.S. economy in a fundamental way. And that comes up as an important question, because you'll see people referring to 2019 levels, and that carries the assumption that the economy looks just like it did in 2019. And I can tell you it doesn't look that way. So the housing component of that, if you consider at the start of COVID, when you told your employees, or you were told as an employee, for the foreseeable future, you can work from home, that was a grant of an increase in real disposable income, because your commuting cost that day was translated into disposable income. Now, if you tell an employee you're going to have to come back to work, you're telling them you're going to take a pay cut. Mm-hmm. So it's not surprising that people would resist that. So what else happened in that transaction? The households in the not too long of a time period after that transaction was made, came to the conclusion, probably at some point we'll have to go partway back. But let's say we only have to go back 2 days a week. Housing is cheaper further out from the urban center in most urban areas. So you might buy a house further out because you can get more house for the same price, because you only have to commute 2 days a week instead of 5 days a week. So you shifted the geographic spatial distribution of housing, I think, in a permanent way. If you went back 10 years ago, there was a big article in the Wall Street Journal about who's going to buy all these boomer suburban 4-bedroom houses. Well, it's going to be millennials who have to have a bedroom for mom and dad and a bedroom for 1.8 kids. I'm not sure about the 0.8, how that works, but and probably 1 or 2 offices. Now that's an important also part of that exchange. You agreed implicitly with your employer you would provide the workspace for yourself in that home as part of the bargain for you being able to work from home. Now that left the owner of the real estate in which you previously worked wondering what's the real value now of this real estate. This is why we're not using the word normal. All these adjustments are still taking place. So you see the valuations in regional banks had fallen pretty significantly because they're heavily invested in commercial real estate in their markets. So this is still working its way through the U.S. economic system. So what about housing? So I was watching the existing home sales number, and I asked my staff, I said, would somebody produce me a chart of the long run level of existing home sales? Because this feels like a floor, like 4 million homes. You can't get lower than that given the U.S. demographic profile. So I looked at that chart. I didn't feel good about it. I said, okay, now let's normalize it for population. So per 1,000 households, it's the lowest it's been in like 4 decades. So it's a certain floor of human activity that drives. You have to move because of maybe you have to have more space for your family. Your job changes, location. There are just certain things that are a fact of life, and maybe 4 million is the lower limit on that. So if you look at the forecast for 25, you'll see that existing home sales forecast is up. I'm not sure. I think the updated forecast is being released today, so I didn't see it this morning, but I think it's up maybe about 10% over last year. New home sales staying pretty close to what they were this year because there is a pretty good sized inventory of new homes available for sale that's waiting for household incomes to catch up to that price point. But another example of the fact that things are not normal is when rates hit that 7% level you saw, and you did introduce 2-1 buy downs, those kind of things to improve affordability issue for first timers. The builders got on board with that too. 2% permanent buy down, for example. If you think about that, that was at a 7% price point. If the Fed eases and the interest rates come down, they're probably going to be somewhere around 5. That's saving that household all the upfront fees they would have had to refinance because they automatically get there because of that buy down, right? So that was a very fast response to a 7% mortgage rate, which just demonstrated how flexible markets can be if they're allowed. So they've sort of exhausted the eligible first-time buyers that can afford to get into the new home space. Difficult for builders to build to that space. Some of them are making progress, but there's a square footage dollar amount that sort of calibrates to their profit margin. And they're in business to make money. So if they can't meet that, then that will impact the supply growth.
So the good news is it'll be our first year in 3 years where housing sales are actually up.
We think so.
If the forecast holds. By the way, a recession is 2 consecutive quarters, technically, where you've had declines. And I think we had 8 in our industry. 7 or 8 quarters of consecutive declines in housing sales. So if it's felt hard, that's because it's been really hard.
Right. That's right.
That's why we did handle hard better. because it's been really hard. And we'll hopefully get to the other side where we can tell a really cool story about getting through hard.
Demographics are positive. That's the good news is every human on the planet puts their head down on a piece of real estate every night. That will always be true.
Yep.
And we have more people, more households forming. So if we get the supply there at affordability, an appropriate level of affordability, it'll be a good business to be in.
So 10% next year. Are you guys out in 26 yet? Or is that just too far down the road and you're not thinking about 26? Or is 26?
That will probably be added. This was October's forecast. Not sure if we, if that's, it should come soon.
Okay, cool. Interest rates next year. We talked about the Fed. So you have them forecasted to be 150 basis points below where they're currently at.
For the Fed funds target.
Fed funds target. So you have November, you have December, and 4 additional cuts next year. So that's 150 basis points on the short-term cost of money. Mm-hmm. And we know that it's not directly correlated to the long-term cost of money. But you could tell us a fib here today and tell us that it's 150 basis points lower. We'd be happy for you to do that. Right. What do you think is going to happen? Your forecast on rates?
I think it's a reasonable thing to assume it'll break through 6%. Which is to some degree a breaking point. But of course, in the time that it takes to get those rates to come down to below 6, you're also seeing household incomes grow.
Right.
And so those two things will meet. And if as long as house prices don't immediately respond by increasing when interest rates come down, then there's affordability should be better through the end of 2025.
We just had the shock of it. The shock was rates were low for a long period of time. The average for the last 25 years is 6 3/4 on 30-year fixed. So we're not anywhere other than where averages are. But it's just with the increased value of homes. And then when we went from 3% to 7% all at once, incomes couldn't catch up quickly enough, right?
Yeah. And they still don't. This consumer surveys being unhappy, there's a mismatch between how households think about their finance and economists measure inflation. So economists define inflation as the period over period change in the general price level. That's why Alan Greenspan said to Janet Yellen, 0% if properly measured. That's an important thing. We're not that great at measuring it. But that's not how households think about it. In fact, my Uber driver, I'm always quizzing the Uber drivers to see what's going on in that part of the world. And I said, he asked, what do you do? And I told him I was an economist. He goes, oh, what about this inflation? And I said,
blaming you for it?
Yeah, right. And I said, what about it? He said, man, I can't afford all these things that I used to be able to afford. What are you going to do about that? And I said, so what does it mean when you read in the press that inflation is down to 3%? He said, that's not what I'm seeing. What households have seen is that the price level went up and it stayed up, and their incomes did not go up at the same pace, and they know that prices are actually still increasing. So they're very unhappy about this for very rational reasons. And that will play out, I believe, in the election. However people decide to attribute fault for this, it's going to be one of the factors that
one of the blessings of retirement then is your Uber driver relationships will improve.
Absolutely.
Because you won't tell them and they won't blame you.
That's right.
So let's, the last idea of forecast for 25 is home price increases. And we all live through the bid pass list. I've been in this industry for a very long period of time. And the concept, I have this one video that I still have on my phone. My son's house went on the market. And I thought the 25 cars were there to get COVID shots. This goes back to the date and time of COVID shots, right? There's this mad line of people. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. And within 24 hours, they had 23 contracts on this house. The list price was X and it was passed. I've never seen it. I sent you the video. I said, this is what's really going on in the marketplace right now. I hope that didn't cause you to retire. No. So what if we had that radical move on, and it's obviously low cost of money, so people could afford more. And then the inventory being shallow and it getting eaten up and people kept bidding it. What's the forecast for prices next year?
I think the most recent actual was up just under 6% from 12 months earlier. So I think the forecast for next year is around 3% additional appreciation. That can easily change depending on what happens with interest rates. Because I do believe that the lack of the growth of supply is still, the level of supply growth is still behind the level of household and willing buyer growth, which means any improvement on the interest rate aspect of affordability may well be
is going to act as a floor for housing prices.
Right. And people have asked, well, what about there's some policy proposals that would offer assistance on the down payment side. All that's going to do is show up in price. Yeah. So, right, and given the current dynamic today, that won't solve the problem it's intended to be solving.
Well, what we know is true about all policy conversations, none of them will ever take place.
Well, so what's really interesting, the roots of this are actually back in the Great Financial Crisis. Mm-hmm. And so we went from building 2.2 million units, single family and multifamily, at the peak to 430,000 roughly. And we stayed at 430,000 for about 3.5 years.
Too long.
So all the people in that supply chain, no matter what part of the supply chain, 3/4 of them left the business. We've been spending all this time rebuilding the supply chain. In the meantime, we conducted monetary policy to lock in the existing owners where they are, right? So the roots of this were planted a long time ago. The Great Financial Crisis led to millions of foreclosures, which we, in our survey work, started to see the change in consumer attitudes at the end of 2012. So we said, okay, housing is now changing profile and it's going to be a growth profile. In 2014, in the fourth quarter, we released a survey result and we said, now the problem is supply. You were like, you have lost your mind. We just had how many million foreclosures? Turns out for 10 years later, we're still talking about the lack of supply.
And it's the benefit of being in the Southeast is people are coming here. But the other part of that trade is we're not building housing nearly fast enough. Values are probably going to get stimulated. Mm-hmm. Hey, if you were talking to your son, he's out thinking about buying a home, and you said, hey, I can only give you 2 things to watch to determine where interest rates are going to go. What are the 2 things that you would tell someone in the audience here to tell their buyers to watch? Because there's so much economic data, so much news that comes out every single day. What would you tell them to watch?
Well, you started with some discussion about employment. And in a given market, if employment is growing, that's effective demand. People who have jobs are earning incomes. Therefore, if they want to buy a house, at some point they will be able to. So if there's not job growth, there's a very good chance that the market is sort of flat because people are not accumulating additional income that would lead them to ownership. If employment is declining, it goes the other direction. So the first thing I'd be watching is what's happening to the local employment market. And incidentally, we were having a conversation about college towns. There are 2 things that lead to stability in a housing market. One is universities, and the other one is hospital systems. Mm. Those 2 things are very resistant to cyclical fluctuation. They're pretty stable. So the other thing that I would watch is what is related to that. What is happening in the supply space, and is there mobility in that space? So there's to some degree in the existing home market, what is missing is churn, because if somebody is selling the home they currently own but buying another one, the net addition to supply is actually 0. Ooh. One on the demand side, one on the supply side. But the churn is important. And that's part of where the pricing comes. Pricing gets adjusted to current market values through that churn. So if there is turnover that's not related to loss of employment, that gives you some sense of the volatility or the vibrancy of that market.
Just for all of our viewers, the first Friday of each month is when non-farm payroll employment report comes out. And that tends to be the big trigger point for direction and interest rates in our business, always has been, to your point. Let's not talk politics.
That's a good idea.
That said, what keeps you up at night? Like as an economist, when you think about where our nation is today from an economic standpoint, what are the things that concern you most?
Yeah, I have to say, recently I have been very concerned about war. This is something we haven't really talked about for a long time, but there's a lot of things going on today. We are actually actively engaged in war in at least two theaters. One is provision of military supply and training in Ukraine. The other one is we just sent 100 soldiers and some of our most advanced anti-missile systems to Israel. This is a change of a magnitude I have not seen since the late 1970s, and actually the late 60s. I joined the Navy in the last couple of years of Vietnam, and there are some similarities in feeling about global geopolitics to what was the case back then. From our perspective, what does it mean for housing? One of the questions is, what do global investors think about U.S., whether it's treasury securities or mortgage-backed securities, fixed income assets? How are they likely to respond to the expansion of hostilities and the impact on trade? And a lot of U.S. housing is funded by foreign investors, whether it's through the treasury market, which is the basis under which pricing of MBS exists, or whether it's direct investment in mortgage-backed securities. So there's a stake in the funding mechanism for housing. It's also the case that some of the increase in the deficit is related to that same issue of global geopolitical strife. And to the extent that those deficits put upward pressure on the yield curve across the curve, that will also bleed into what we see in the mortgage space. So that's the number one thing that's on my mind. The related connection that we have some control over in the U.S. is the level of debt and deficits that we're accumulating. It is significant to me that this year the interest expense on our debt will exceed the defense budget.
Wow,
that's not a trivial fact.
Ooh. I only worry about whether Alabama's going to win. Big concern. That's what keeps me up at night.
Yeah, I'm a North Dakota State Bison, so
they are Coach Webb there. Final question, and then we're going to invite the audience to ask questions. But we ask this every time because I think it's really something that for this audience and for the people that they represent every day, they don't want to be biased if their consumers are anxious about making a big investment right now called a home, buying a home. And I don't care how often you do it, it's a big investment. So the timing of it and the emotions that go along with money usually get involved. But we want this group to be able to have some material from you that can actually give, wisdom and counsel. Doug Duncan, is it a good time to buy a home?
I haven't been able to change the answer for something like 30 years. If you have a family budget, and at today's price and interest rate and the amount that you would have to finance to acquire the house that you're looking at, it fits the budget, it's a good time to buy. If you're guessing where prices will go or guessing where interest rates will go, now you've moved from being a home buyer to being a speculator. Some people can afford that, and that's fine. But just know where you are. If you're buying a house for your family to live in, if it fits the budget, then if interest rates go down in the future, you can refinance and improve your financial situation. If they go up, you've moved in at a preferential time. So it really starts with your understanding of your household budget. And by the way, people that come in to any of you with a household budget will know the answer to every question you are going to ask them about their financial fitness to be able to qualify for that house. So it's in your interest for them to come in with a budget as well.
It's simple, but it's brilliant. It just keeps people from getting too emotional about the decision that they've already made. I mean, they show up because they do indeed have a need to buy a home or to trade the home that they have for any number of reasons. But all of the other things that go into money are emotional. And oftentimes people are listening too much to the noise instead of if you have a budget and it fits the budget, it's the home that you want, it's a good time to buy a home.
Hi, Doug. My name is Molly Gorman, and I am a team leader at a Keller Williams Real Estate Market Center. And my question for you is, we haven't really touched on where, total consumer household debt is right now. And I think credit card debt, the average interest rate is about 24%. So how does that play into your projections for the 2025 housing market?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Interest rates on credit card debt are the highest they've ever been, actually. And lower and moderate income households are accumulating and rolling over debt. That is a sign of stress at the lower end of the income spectrum. So to the extent that your client group is in that more moderate income space, that may well be something that you'll be seeing as they bring financials to the table. It's also the case that the level of automobile debt is back to pre-COVID levels, as is the credit card debt. On the automobile debt, the interest rates are also much higher, not historic levels, but much higher. But what has happened on the auto side is that auto sales have slowed appreciably from some 17.5 million down to around 15 million. And it's simply because those households can't afford the auto loans at those interest rates, so they're simply not in the market. So it's not that they're in trouble on their auto debt, but they just can't get in the market because of that affordability issue. So yes, at the lower end of the spectrum, it's part of the reason why people who don't look carefully into the data don't understand the angst that shows up in the consumer surveys. Is they're looking only at the GDP number, which looks real good, but that's not how lots of the households are actually experiencing it. Many of the policies have augmented the divergence in the income distribution in the country, and there's a lot of unhappiness about that for reasonable reasons.
Gentlemen, Jason Porter, assistant coach at the Keller Williams South Forsyth office. Doug, thank you for being here. I appreciate your insight and your candor. I've looked forward to this for a long time. Pat, I appreciate you hosting me as well. Thank you. My question is, you spoke about the influence of foreign investment in the housing market. What are your forecasts for national debt as it relates to how that would affect the foreign influence in the housing market and the long-term national debt?
The influence of foreign investors in residential real estate in the U.S. Fluctuates with things like exchange rates and relative interest rates in the country of origin versus the U.S. I don't know that I would expect a dramatic shift in either direction of that in the near term. What's more likely to be the case is you could imagine if a conflict with countries which had significant investments in U.S. treasuries decided that one aspect of that would be to reduce the portfolio of treasuries they have. They sold out of that portfolio, someone else would have to pick that up. And that would have an impact on interest rates. The direction of it depends on what's the new need for funding that's coming online domestically. And at the present time, neither presidential candidate has shown any concern about whether or not the level of indebtedness should be constrained. So those things working together, I think, don't at the moment bode well for the path of interest rates. So let me make just a comment about how I would, if I'm Pat, in Pat's shoes, how would I think about my next 10-year plan for mortgages? And He's so young, 10 years is a minor part of his career. But if you look back from the year 2000 to say when the VA became fully operational, so you had most of the demand side financing in place, the average 30-year fixed rate mortgage in that time frame was about 6%. The economy during that time period grew in real terms at 3% annually, including recessions. So a 6% mortgage to a 3% growth rate. The Congressional Budget Office, which produces the official estimate of growth, potential growth for the U.S. economy, say right now it's around 2.25%. So if you use that, do that little fractional equation, it suggests a 4.5% mortgage rate. I actually think that's too low based on what I've said about the debt and the deficit that we're going to have to fund. So I think you have to add some basis points to that. So housing, I don't believe the cycle has been repealed. Housing is cyclical. It's been interrupted by that interim monetary policy that drove rates down to 2% or whatever in the mortgage space. But if the Fed gets inflation back to what they find as acceptable, and now a housing cycle, normal housing cycle emerges, I would think of interest rates being from at the low point, 4.5%, at the top 6%, the median 5.25%. I think that's a reasonable starting point for building a budget. The question that he asks is, if that's the baseline, I would say the alternative is a higher rate profile than the baseline.
My name is Jeff Patterson. I'm a team leader at Keller Williams Atlanta Perimeter. My questions center around sustainability. So how sustainable is the current housing market given elevated interest rates and affordability challenges?
That word sustainability is a really interesting word. And I love language, but the English language, I'm still attempting to conquer it. But we asked the question, has housing policy led to sustainability? And actually, FHFA, the director, as our regulator, is coordinating some research between Fannie, Freddie, and them as the regulator on exactly that question. So why would I phrase it that way? Let's suppose someone buys a home in 2005 and extracts some equity in 2007 because house prices have gone up significantly. And then in 2009, you have the collapse and they're underwater because they borrowed some of that equity and they fail in the house. How do you think about that from a sustainability perspective? Because there was a decision made in the middle of that time frame that altered the financial structure of that household, right? So it's an interesting question. Is today's environment sustainable? Well, it will be over time if incomes increase faster than house prices increase, then affordability, and interest rates go up and down and will always go up and down. So that's more of a temporary factor. And to Pat's point, it's how fast they change that's the matter. Because I bought my first house with a mortgage from Sears Mortgage at 8.5%, if you remember Sears, at 8.5%, and thought I was getting a great deal. And today, people would be really complaining about an 8.5% mortgage, right? So it's more about the supply issue and about income growth is really the trick in all this.
Once upon a time, Doug told me that he sleeps with a dictionary on his nightstand. Any of you sleep with a dictionary on your nightstand? I don't either. So we had this exchange about the Fed and are they ever really right? Do they ever really get it right? And this started a couple of years ago when they said that inflation was
transitory.
And then you looked up transitory.
And it says not permanent.
So, because their thesis at the time was that this is just a bump in the road and it'll go away. Of course, it they were right.
Pretty good size bump.
Pretty big, good size. So I just thought, because I've never forgot that, we've had a lot of good jokes about it, that I would get you a gift. Doug got me a T-shirt a couple of years ago that had this graph on it that would make you dizzy. He said it was his favorite graph. And I mean, I could spend the rest of my life as his student and I'd still never understand what was on that graph, but he does. So we got your T-shirt, Doug, that life is transitory.
That's true. Thank you. That is great.
I love it. By the way, so all of you know, I have gotten in line with a number of other folks. Again, he had 150,000 people hit his LinkedIn when they found out he was retiring him. But we got early into the process with Doug. And I told him, I said, listen, I'd like you to be like permanent with us. You know, you can be on our program. It won't require much of you. You already kind of know the thing. You'll smile a lot more because you don't work full time at Fannie Mae anymore. But I hope all of you will continue to cheer that Doug comes back because we'd like to have you back.
Thank you. It's been great.